Welcome back, everybody, to another Hero Forge painting tutorial. Today, we have this Forestguard Druid, and we're going to run the gambit on painting tutorials today, because we're going to be painting some simple light blue skin. We're going to work on adding some texture, and most exciting, we're going to learn how to paint a tartan. Starting off with his skin, I want a light pale blue, and for that I'm using Vallejo model color dark blue gray as our starting point. Because we have so little skin showing, and also we're using a fairly light skin color, I'm not quite bothering with any shades here. We can add a little dark line at the end of the project, but we are just applying the base coat here, and then we're going to highlight that twice. For our highlights, we are going to mix in some pale sand, which is kind of like an ivory color. We could use white here, but using colors that are just a little bit darker or a little bit closer to your base coat makes it easier to mix the colors. But if you only have white, that's fine. You can use white, just don't add too much. Our second and final highlight, simply with more of the pale sand added. Once again, not bothering with any shades because the skin tone is so light and we have so little of the skin showing. Our main focus is just on the face and a little bit on the arms. Just because we are using two highlights doesn't mean we're completely done with the skin. Want to add a little bit of warmth, so a mix of rose brown with pale sand. Rose brown is like a very warm flesh tone. Mix that up to a glaze consistency, and adding that color around the ears and a little bit around the nose and some around the knuckles, just to give a little bit of a tonal variation to those areas. And then for the nose, adding a very thin glaze of burnt red. You can see we add a very small dot and then feather it around into the surrounding area. Just again, add a little bit more character to the face. Moving on to the hair, and decided to go for a red-brown hair color. Using, once again, burnt red, since we already have that on our palette. But I do want it a little bit more brown, so we mix in a little charred brown for our first coat. For our first highlight, adding in some Parasite Brown, which is an orange brown. Lots of different variations you can add here. We can add more red, we can add more browns. I decided to go a little bit more towards the orange range. Final highlight, adding some yellow ochre because I want to lighten up the mixture that I currently have on my palette. And unlike with the skin, because we have hair that has depth, we need to have a lot more contrast, so we still have that original burnt red, charred brown color showing through on the recessed areas, and being very cautious with our final highlight so we have the contrast between all four colors within the hair. Alright, so let's do the hard part. We're going to paint a tartan now. Starting off with a base coat of heavy green mixed with uniform green. And right now I am doing just one highlight by adding more uniform green. We need to keep our canvas very simple here because we're going to be adding a complex hand-painted pattern to it. So we don't want a bunch of highlights and shades and contrast, which will actually disguise the pattern we're about to paint. So in this case, we got to keep it very simple. So we're going to do this in stages, and step number 1 is a thick line with heavy blue, and trying to do our best to keep it as straight as possible. We don't want to, at this stage, draw the smallest line we possibly can. Mainly concerned about getting it straight and even. Second part of this step is the much easier one. We just have to horizontally connect all the lines that we've already painted. So now it's going to get a little bit harder because now we want to mix up a lighter color from what we just used, and we want to draw a line inside the line that we already drew. So smaller brush, nice thin one brush stroke going down in the middle of our thick blue line, using some flow improver or glaze medium or something like that will also help to prevent the paint from drying on the tip of your brush before you can actually use it. But do your best to keep these as straight as possible. So you could call it a day right here because we just painted a tartan, but we could complicate it a bit more if you so choose. Now I'm doing the exact same thing I just did with Cavalry Brown, but we're painting very thin lines in between all the lines that we already painted. So we're complicating up the pattern just a little bit. If you still want to add a little bit more details, we can go back to wherever our lines cross and add a highlight there. Sky blue in this case for the blue areas, and then I also mixed up a lighter reddish brown for the brown areas. At this stage, we can go back to our green and do any cleanup work as necessary. I also decided to add just a little bit more highlighting along the edges. Again, we do not want to add too much contrast to this pattern. Something else you can do is add a universal shade to the pattern. For example, a dark brown would work really well. If you had a lot of recessed areas over the pattern, you can just put in a few dark brown washes. Didn't really think it was necessary here. For his cloak, in my mind I had the picture of a kind of a ratty thing, so I want to add some texture to it to give it the idea that it's threadbare. Started off with a mix of black and black red, and now I'm going over that with straight black red, and you can see I'm trying to paint horizontal lines along the cloak. It's kind of soft right now. We're going to increase the detail with the upcoming strokes, but just want to kind of block in the pattern that we're going to emphasize with the next step. Adding some Cavalry Brown for our highlights. Remember, we used that color on the kilt, so we are tying it together here. And once again, just applying horizontal lines wherever we would normally apply regular highlights. A reminder that the thicker your paint, the stronger your texture is going to be. In this case, I just have the paint slightly thinned, a little bit thicker than the previous step. Adding some bone white for our final highlight color. And it's not a color I would normally use on red-brown, but I do want a faded look, and the addition of the bone white does help with that. And once again, applying the highlights where we typically would if we were doing this with the normal layering method, working our way towards the highest tips of the cloak and towards the edges. And also the paint's getting a little bit thicker at this stage, so the final highlights on the edges are much more prominent than the first ones we put down. For our little feathered friend, we are once again going to paint him with texture, this time using dots rather than lines, so we get the impression of a feather pattern. Starting off with leather brown as our undercoat, and now painting on beastie brown. This is a very heavy stipple right now. We want to lighten up the areas that are eventually going to get a very light coat on them, but we still want to leave the leather brown showing in a few areas in the recesses. Our next color is green ochre, and you can see the stippling pattern much more prominent now. We can kind of get the impression of some feathers, and highlighting the areas we would expect to see a lighter color on an owl. So predominantly we are working on the underbelly color and also a little bit around the face as well. Next, using bone white to highlight our green ochre. And one thing to keep in mind, much like with painting the tartan, we have to keep this a little bit more simplified than what we would see on a realistic animal, in this case an owl. There's a lot more depth and complexity to the feather colors, but we have a very small creature here, so we have to keep things a bit more simple. And then our final color, a little camo black-brown to add a little bit of dark feathers towards the ends of the wing tips, and that's about it. And there we have one Forestguard Druid. So we started with a very simple paint scheme for the skin, which we spiced up with a little bit of red. We painted two different types of texture, very easy to paint texture as you can see, and it really spices up the miniature. And we also painted a little bit more complex tartan pattern for his kilt. And you can see if we take it step by step, it kind of breaks it down, makes it a little bit more simple, I hope. I know painting straight lines is a little difficult. It is something you do have to work at. Again, if you mix in a little bit of glaze medium, that can slow down the dry time and give you a few extra seconds to clean up any mistakes. But that is it for our Druid. Hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.